They say that a single moment can shatter a life. In the sprawling estate of the Prescott family in Boston, a girl's laughter once echoed through sunlit meadows, but a single tragic event would rewrite her story forever. What secrets lay buried beneath the grandeur? And how far can someone go to protect what they love, even at the cost of their soul? Don't miss a moment of this gripping tale. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the truths no one dares to speak. The spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Prescott mansion, illuminating a dining room filled with tension. Victor Prescott, a man of striking authority with graying temples and an ever-present air of impatience, skimmed his morning papers while occasionally glancing at his young daughter, Ansley. "Eat quickly, Ansley," Victor instructed without looking up. "You'll need energy for today's competition." Ansley, her auburn curls glinting in the sunlight, nodded obediently. At 10, she was accustomed to following her father's lead, even when her heart whispered caution. Today, she would compete in the local equestrian trials, a tradition her father insisted on maintaining despite her nervous protests. Emily, the warm-hearted family governess, entered the room carrying a tray of freshly baked biscuits. "Mr. Prescott, I think Ansley might benefit from skipping this one. She's been nervous all week." Victor set his paper down, his piercing eyes locking onto Emily. "Emily, this family doesn't skip anything. Ansley needs to understand the value of perseverance." Emily pursed her lips but said nothing. She knew arguing with Victor was futile, and her focus remained on Ansley, who gave a small, forced smile as she nibbled at her toast. By afternoon, the equestrian fields were alive with the scent of grass and the hum of spectators. Ansley stood by her horse, Starfire, gently stroking his mane. He was a magnificent creature, sleek, black, and regal. "We'll do fine, won't we, Starfire?" she whispered. The first few obstacles went smoothly, her heart lifting as the crowd cheered. Victor watched from the VIP box, his sharp nods signaling approval. But as Starfire approached the final jump, a towering fence lined with hedges, something spooked him. The horse reared, and Ansley's grip faltered. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her small frame crumpling against the ground. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd before silence took over. Victor bolted from his seat, his expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. By the time he reached her, Ansley was unconscious, her breathing shallow. Emily arrived moments later, her face pale with fear. "Call an ambulance!" Victor barked, clutching Ansley's limp hand. "She'll be okay," Emily said softly, though her trembling voice betrayed her doubt. The hospital room was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the vibrant fields where the accident had occurred. Ansley lay motionless, tubes and monitors surrounding her small body. Victor stood at the foot of the bed, his face unreadable. Emily sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. A nurse entered with a clipboard. "Mr. Prescott, we need to discuss next steps. Ansley's condition is critical. We recommend immediate surgery." Victor stiffened. "Is it life-threatening?" "It could be if we wait too long," the nurse replied. Before Victor could respond, Emily interrupted. "Do it. She's just a child. Please don't take chances." Victor hesitated, his mind racing with concerns over risks, costs, and outcomes. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Proceed." Back at the Prescott estate that evening, Emily wandered into Ansley's room, drawn to the familiar warmth of her belongings. Among her toys and books, she noticed something curious, an old, weathered key lying on the nightstand. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "Where did you find this, Ansley?" she murmured aloud, as if the girl could answer. Later that night, Emily confronted Victor. "Ansley had this key. Do you know where it came from?" Victor barely glanced at it. "It's probably from one of her games." "Don't read into things that don't matter, Emily." But Emily's instincts told her otherwise. Something about the key felt important, almost sacred, as though it held a secret Ansley was too young to understand. The next morning, the hospital called with an update. "Mr. Prescott, your daughter's condition is stable for now, but she hasn't woken up. We'll continue monitoring her closely." Victor barely acknowledged the nurse before hanging up. Returning to his study, he poured himself a drink and stared out the window. The weight of guilt began to settle in. His mind flashed back to his late wife, Eleanor, whose death had also stemmed from an equestrian accident. He remembered her pleading with him years ago, "Victor, this isn't safe. Promise me you won't let Ansley compete." But Victor's ambitions always seemed to override caution. As he drained his glass, he muttered to himself, "Eleanor, I failed you." Unbeknownst to Victor, Emily was downstairs, sitting by Starfire's stable. The horse had been restless all night, pawing the ground and releasing distressed whinnies. She patted his side, whispering, "Don't worry, boy. She'll be home soon." But even as she tried to reassure herself, a shadow moved in the corner of her eye, someone or something lurking near the far end of the stables. She turned sharply, but the figure disappeared into the darkness before she could see it clearly. As the Prescott household grappled with fear and uncertainty, one thing was becoming clear: this was no ordinary accident. Secrets long buried were beginning to resurface, and the presence of the mysterious key hinted at a past neither Victor nor Emily were ready to confront. What was the key meant to unlock? And who, or what, was the figure watching from the shadows? The Prescott mansion, once a haven of opulence and order, had become a place of unease. Ansley's absence hung over the estate like a storm cloud, and every creak of the wooden floors seemed louder, every shadow deeper. Victor retreated further into his work, burying his guilt beneath endless business calls and documents. Emily, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The mysterious key weighed heavily on her mind, and Starfire's restless behavior only heightened her anxiety. It was a week after the accident when Emily approached Victor in his study. He sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of his late wife. The resemblance between Eleanor and Ansley was uncanny, the same fiery curls, the same curious eyes. "You haven't been to the hospital in 3 days," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. Victor didn't look up. "I'm handling things my way, Emily. Don't tell me how to grieve." "I'm not telling you how to grieve," she replied, her voice steady. "But Ansley needs her father. If she wakes up and you're not there—" "She's strong," Victor interrupted. "She'll understand." Emily clenched her fists, fighting back tears of frustration. "Strong? She's 10 years old, Victor. She's lying in a hospital bed, and all she's ever wanted is your attention." Her words cut through the air like a blade, leaving Victor momentarily speechless. He turned away, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain control. Later that evening, Emily returned to Ansley's room, seeking solace among the child's belongings. The old key still sat on the nightstand, its worn edges glinting faintly in the lamplight. Unable to resist, she slipped it into her pocket and began searching the house for anything it might unlock. Hours passed with no success. As she moved to the attic, her flashlight beam caught the edge of a wooden trunk tucked into a corner. She tried the key, and to her surprise, it turned smoothly. Inside, she found a collection of faded letters, a leather-bound journal, and a photograph of a young woman, Eleanor. The letters were addressed to Victor and dated years before Ansley's birth. Emily unfolded one carefully, her heart pounding as she read. "Victor, I'm begging you. Don't let ambition blind you to what matters most. The risks you're taking could destroy this family. Please, for Ansley's sake, stop before it's too late." Emily's hands trembled as she closed the trunk. Eleanor's words hinted at a history of conflict and danger that Victor had never shared. The next morning, Emily tried to confront Victor again. She brought the photograph and letters to his study, placing them on his desk with a firm resolve. "Explain this," she demanded. Victor's face darkened as he glanced at the letters. "Where did you find these?" "In a trunk in the attic," she replied. "Eleanor was trying to warn you about something." "What was she talking about, Victor?" He snatched the letters from the desk, crumpling one in his fist. "This is none of your concern." "None of my concern?" Emily's voice rose. Ansley is lying in a hospital because you refuse to listen to warnings like these. You owe her the truth." Victor stood abruptly, his towering presence casting a shadow over Emily. "Leave it alone," he said coldly. "You don't know what you're talking about." Frustrated and hurt, Emily left the study and went to check on Starfire. The horse greeted her with a soft nicker, but his eyes seemed troubled. She stroked his mane, whispering, "What's going on, boy? What aren't they telling us?" As she stood there, she noticed something strange. Starfire kept nudging a loose floorboard near the edge of the stable. Curious, Emily pried it open and found a small, wrapped bundle inside. Unfolding the cloth, she uncovered a rusted locket with the initials EP engraved on the front. Inside was a tiny photograph of Eleanor holding a baby, Ansley. That night, as Emily tried to piece together the connections, she heard faint voices from Victor's study. Creeping closer, she realized he was on a heated phone call. "I don't care what it takes," he hissed. "Get rid of anything that could link this to me. Do you understand?" Emily's blood ran cold. Who was Victor talking to? And what was he so desperate to hide? At the hospital the next day, Ansley's condition remained unchanged. Victor finally made an appearance, though his time at her bedside was brief. He sat in silence, his expression unreadable as he held her small hand. Emily arrived shortly after he left, her heart heavy with the weight of her discoveries. As she sat by Ansley's side, she noticed something unusual. The old key was now clutched tightly in Ansley's hand, though she hadn't brought it with her. "Where did you get that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Ansley's hand twitched slightly, the first movement Emily had seen since the accident. Returning to the estate that evening, Emily decided to search the stables again. As she approached, she spotted a figure in the distance, lingering near the edge of the property. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but their presence felt deliberate, almost menacing. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The figure turned and walked away without a word, disappearing into the night. Emily stood frozen, her heart racing. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the Prescott family's secrets were more dangerous than she had imagined. What did Victor's phone call mean? And who was the figure lurking near the estate? More importantly, what role did Eleanor's warnings and the mysterious key play in all of this? The next morning dawned heavy with fog, the kind that clung to the Prescott estate like a shroud. Emily hadn't slept. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, the shadowy figure, Victor's cryptic phone call, and the impossible sight of Ansley holding the old key at the hospital. She couldn't ignore the mounting sense of dread. Victor had already left the house when Emily ventured into the kitchen, her coffee growing cold as she stared out the window. The stables were quiet now, but Starfire's restless behavior from the night before lingered in her thoughts. Could the horse sense something they couldn't? Her reverie was broken when one of the house staff approached her hesitantly. "Miss Emily, you might want to see this," the young maid said, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. Emily unfolded it carefully. The note was hastily scrawled, the ink smeared in places. "Keep your head down. This isn't your fight." "Where did you find this?" Emily demanded, her voice low but urgent. "It was slipped under the back door," the maid replied. "I thought you should know." Emily's hands trembled as she folded the note. Someone was watching her, and whoever it was wanted her to stop digging. But the warning only strengthened her resolve. Later that day, Emily made her way to the hospital, the locket she'd found in the stable tucked securely in her pocket. Ansley's room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of monitors. The girl's small frame looked even more fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sitting beside her, Emily took the locket and placed it gently in Ansley's hand. "If you can hear me, sweetheart, I think this belonged to your mother," she whispered. "And I think she wanted you to have it." For a moment, nothing happened. But then, as if in response, Ansley's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the locket. Emily gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "You're still with us," she said, her voice cracking. Her relief was short-lived. A nurse entered the room, her expression neutral but her tone clipped. "Miss, you're not supposed to leave personal items with the patient." "It's just a locket," Emily protested. "It might help her feel connected." "I'll have to confiscate it," the nurse said firmly, extending her hand. Emily hesitated but eventually handed over the locket, feeling a pang of guilt and frustration. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, not just with the nurse, but with the entire hospital. Back at the estate, Emily decided to revisit the letters she'd found in the attic. One in particular caught her attention. "Victor, you promised me you'd protect her. But your ambition blinds you to the danger we're in. If something happens to me, promise you'll keep her safe." The letter was unsigned, but Emily recognized the handwriting. It matched the signature in Ainsley's school enrollment forms. Eleanor had written this letter before her death. "What danger?" Emily murmured aloud. She scanned the other letters, hoping for more clues. One note stood out, a list of names and dates, some circled and others crossed out. Emily didn't recognize any of the names, but the final entry made her blood run cold. Written in bold letters were the words, "For Starfire." That evening, Victor returned home, his expression as closed off as ever. Emily intercepted him before he could retreat to his study. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Victor sighed. "Emily, I've had a long day." "This isn't about you," she snapped. "It's about Ainsley. And Eleanor." Victor froze at the mention of his late wife's name. "What about Eleanor?" Emily took a deep breath. "I found more letters in the attic. She was warning you about something. About danger. And now Ainsley's accident, the key, the locket. I don't think this is a coincidence." Victor's jaw tightened. "You're overstepping, Emily." "Maybe I am," she admitted. "But someone left me a note today. Someone is watching us, Victor. If you know something, you need to tell me." For a moment, Victor looked as though he might break. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes softened. But then the mask returned, and he shook his head. "Drop it, Emily. This isn't your business." Frustrated and angry, Emily stormed out to the stables. Starfire greeted her with a soft whinny, nudging her shoulder as if sensing her distress. "What are we going to do, boy?" she asked, stroking his mane. Her question was answered moments later when she heard movement outside the stable. She peeked through the slats and saw the same shadowy figure from the previous night, lingering near the edge of the property. This time, Emily didn't hesitate. Grabbing a flashlight, she stepped outside and called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure turned slowly, their face obscured by a hood. They didn't speak but instead dropped something on the ground before disappearing into the darkness. Emily approached cautiously, her flashlight beam illuminating the object, a torn piece of paper with a single phrase written in bold letters. "The truth lies beneath." Unable to sleep, Emily returned to the attic, the cryptic note replaying in her mind. Beneath what? The house? The stables? She examined the trunk again, running her fingers along its edges. As she did, she felt a slight indentation near the base, a hidden compartment. Using a screwdriver, she pried it open, revealing a small metal box. Inside the box was a map of the estate, with several locations marked in red. One mark stood out, a spot near the stable's labeled entrance. Emily's heart raced as she studied the map. Whatever secrets the Prescotts were hiding, they were buried deep, both literally and figuratively. But as she folded the map, she heard a noise behind her, a floorboard creaking under the weight of someone else. Spinning around, she found herself face to face with Victor. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his eyes blazing. Emily clutched the map tightly. "Finding the truth." Victor's face darkened, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into, Emily. Stop this, before it's too late." "What are you so afraid of?" she challenged. Victor didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily alone with the map, and the growing realization that she was on the brink of uncovering something far bigger than she'd imagined. The air around the Prescott estate seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the very ground knew it held secrets too dark to be unearthed. Emily sat in her room, the map spread across her desk. The spot near the stable's labeled entrance called to her, but the fear in Victor's eyes earlier that night lingered in her mind. What was buried there, and why was Victor so desperate to keep it hidden? The next morning, Emily slipped out early, determined to investigate the marked location. Starfire greeted her with a low nicker as she approached the stable, his dark eyes watching her every move. "It's just you and me now," she whispered, running a hand along his mane. Using the map, she navigated to the marked area just behind the stable. The ground was covered in overgrown ivy, but the faint outline of a trapdoor became visible as she pulled the vines away. Her heart pounded as she knelt to examine it, but before she could open it, a voice behind her froze her in place. "What are you doing?" Emily turned sharply to see Victor standing there, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "I found this on your wife's map," Emily said, gesturing to the trapdoor. "What's down there, Victor?" "That's none of your concern," he snapped, stepping closer. "It is my concern when it affects Ansley." Emily shot back, her voice rising. "You've been hiding something, and it nearly cost your daughter her life. I'm not stopping until I know what's going on." Victor's jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he might physically block her from the trapdoor. But then he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "If I tell you the truth, you won't forgive me," he said quietly. "Try me," Emily said, her voice firm. Victor knelt and pulled open the trapdoor, revealing a set of stone steps leading into darkness. "Eleanor didn't want this to happen," he began as they descended. "She tried to stop me. But I didn't listen." The passage smelled of damp earth and decay, and Emily's flashlight revealed walls lined with shelves of old boxes and documents. At the end of the corridor stood a locked iron door. "What is this place?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor hesitated. "This is where I hid the truth." He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, revealing a small room filled with ledgers, photographs, and a single weathered trunk. Emily recognized the trunk immediately, it matched the one in the attic. Victor opened it and took out a bundle of letters and a photograph of Eleanor standing beside Starfire as a colt. "This isn't just a horse," Victor said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Starfire was bred from a line of horses linked to an old family trust. Eleanor's family. When she married me, she brought the trust into our name. But I misused it." Emily's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "I drained the trust to fund my business ventures," Victor admitted, his voice cracking. "Eleanor found out and threatened to go public. She said she'd expose everything if I didn't put it back." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "You're telling me you destroyed your family's legacy for money?" "I didn't think it would go this far," Victor said, his voice desperate. "I thought I could fix it before anyone found out. But Eleanor refused to forgive me. She said the trust wasn't just about money, it was a symbol of her family's history, of everything they'd built." Emily paced the room, anger bubbling to the surface. "So you ignored her warnings, you pushed Ansley into writing, and now," she stopped, realization dawning. "Starfire is the last connection to that trust, isn't he? That's why he's so important." Victor nodded grimly. "If Starfire is lost, the remaining assets are forfeited. Eleanor knew this. She made sure the horse was protected in her will, even after her death. But now someone else knows. Someone who wants to destroy what little remains." Emily's mind raced. The shadowy figure, the cryptic warnings, the nurse at the hospital confiscating the locket, it was all connected. "Who's after the trust?" she asked. Victor shook his head. "I don't know. But I've been trying to keep it quiet, to protect Ansley." "Protect her?" Emily spat. "You've done nothing but put her in harm's way." Victor's face crumpled, and for the first time, Emily saw genuine regret. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice breaking. I failed Eleanor. I failed Ansley. But I'm trying to fix it now. Their argument was cut short by a noise from above, footsteps echoing through the stable. Someone's here, Emily whispered. Victor extinguished the flashlight, and they both listened. The footsteps grew louder, descending into the passage. Emily's heart raced as the faint glow of another flashlight appeared at the far end of the corridor. Who's there? Victor called out, his voice firm. The figure stepped into the light, and Emily gasped. It was the same hooded person she'd seen near the stables. They pulled back their hood, revealing a gaunt, pale face, one Emily didn't recognize, but that sent a chill down her spine. I think you know who I am, Mr. Prescott, the figure said, their voice cold and sharp. Victor's face turned white. You're Eleanor's brother. The man nodded. I've waited a long time for this moment. Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking. What do you want? Justice, the man replied, his eyes narrowing. Victor stole everything from my family. Eleanor begged me not to interfere, but after her death, I couldn't sit by anymore. Ansley's accident was a warning, stay out of this. Emily's blood boiled. A warning? She's just a child. The man shrugged, unbothered by her outrage. Children are part of the legacy. If they inherit, the cycle continues. I won't let that happen. Victor stepped between them, his voice trembling. You can't bring Eleanor back. Hurting Ansley won't fix anything. No, the man said. But it will end the Prescott name. The man's words hung in the air, a chilling reminder that the Prescott family's troubles were far from over. Emily's heart pounded as she realized the stakes were higher than she'd imagined. Who else would be caught in the crossfire of Victor's greed and Eleanor's legacy? The hooded man's chilling declaration left the air in the underground room thick with tension. Emily glanced at Victor, who stood frozen, his face pale and his breath shallow. The weight of his past misdeeds loomed large, and now their consequences threatened the very survival of his family. Why drag Ansley into this? Emily demanded, stepping forward despite the fear gnawing at her. She's innocent in all of this. Innocent? The man spat, his voice cold and unyielding. She's the heir to Victor's sins. That child stands to inherit everything my sister fought to protect. If she does, this cycle of greed will never end. Victor raised a trembling hand. Please, she's just a little girl. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted this. Don't you dare speak her name, the man snapped, his eyes narrowing with fury. You robbed her of her dreams. You drove her to despair. You're the reason she's dead. Emily's chest tightened as the man's words hit like a thunderclap. She had suspected there was more to Eleanor's death, but hearing it confirmed left her shaken. It was an accident, Victor stammered. An accident you caused, the man roared, slamming his fist against the stone wall. You ignored her warnings, you silenced her voice, and when she tried to fight back, you cut her off from everything she loved. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let the conversation spiral further into anger and recrimination, not when Ansley's life still hung in the balance. Look, she said, her tone as calm as she could manage. What's done is done. But taking this out on Ansley isn't justice, it's cruelty. She doesn't deserve this. The man turned to Emily, his gaze hard. Do you think Eleanor deserved what happened to her? Do you think I deserve to watch my sister's legacy burn to ashes? She would want Ansley to have a chance, Emily replied firmly. If you loved Eleanor, you know that's true. For a moment, the man hesitated, his hardened exterior cracking just enough to reveal a glimmer of doubt. The stalemate was broken by a sudden noise from the stable above. The sound of hooves against the wooden floor echoed through the passage, followed by Starfire's agitated whinny. Someone else is here, Emily whispered, her pulse quickening. Victor nodded, stepping cautiously toward the stairs. Stay here, he said to Emily, his voice low but commanding. No, Emily shot back. If this involves Ansley, I'm not staying out of it. Together, They ascended the stairs, leaving Eleanor's brother behind. As they emerged into the stable, they found Starfire pacing anxiously in his stall, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong," Emily said, her gaze darting around the dimly lit stable. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in a suit, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. He carried an air of authority that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Mr. Prescott," the man said, his voice smooth but menacing. "It seems your little secret has gotten out." Victor stepped forward, his body tense. "Who are you?" "I represent certain interested parties," the man replied, his lips curling into a smirk. "Parties who have a stake in ensuring this situation is resolved to their satisfaction." Emily felt her stomach drop. "You mean the trust?" The man's gaze shifted to her, his smile widening. "Smart girl." "Yes, the trust. It's a valuable asset, and my employers don't take kindly to the kind of chaos you're stirring up." Victor clenched his fists. "I told you I'd handle it." "You've had your chance," the man said coldly. "But now, things have escalated. That child of yours is proving to be a liability." Emily's blood boiled. "Ansley is a 10-year-old girl. She's not a liability, she's a victim of your greed." The man's expression darkened. "Sentimentality won't protect her, Miss Emily. If you care about that girl, you'll convince Mr. Prescott to cooperate." Victor's voice trembled with anger. "What do you want from me?" "Simple," the man said, stepping closer. "Sign over what's left of the trust. Cut your losses. Walk away." "And if I refuse?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile returned, colder than before. "Then we'll ensure that the Prescott name and its heirs cease to be a problem." Emily stepped between them, her heart pounding. "You're threatening a child. Do you hear yourself? This isn't business, it's monstrous." The man shrugged, his indifference chilling. "Call it what you will. But in my line of work, loose ends are dangerous. That girl is a loose end." Starfire let out a sharp, defiant whinny, stamping his hooves against the floor. The noise startled the man, who took a step back. Emily seized the moment. Starfire isn't just a horse. He's the key to everything Eleanor cared about. And if you think we'll let you destroy him, or Ansley, you're wrong. The man's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Bold words," he said, his tone colder than ever. "But boldness won't save you." As he turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder and added, "You have 24 hours, Mr. Prescott. Make the right choice." After the man disappeared into the night, Emily turned to Victor, her eyes blazing. "This is your fault, Victor. Your greed, your lies, it's all coming back to haunt you." Victor sank onto a bale of hay, his face buried in his hands. "I never meant for this to happen," he murmured. "It doesn't matter what you meant," Emily snapped. "What matters is what you're going to do now." Victor looked up at her, his eyes filled with desperation. "What can I do? If I give them what they want, the trust is gone. Eleanor's legacy is gone." Emily knelt in front of him, her voice firm but kind. "You fight. For Ansley, for Eleanor, for everything you've lost. But you don't do it alone." As they sat in the quiet of the stable, the weight of their decisions pressing down on them, a faint noise broke the silence, the sound of a soft cry from Starfire's stall. Emily turned, her breath catching as she saw what lay beneath the horse's hooves. It was another note, this one scrawled in familiar handwriting. "The truth lies not in what you see, but in what you refuse to face." The message sent a chill through Emily. What truth had Victor been avoiding? And how could they uncover it before time ran out? The night air carried a sense of foreboding as Emily stared at the cryptic note left in Starfire's stall. The phrase echoed in her mind like a warning bell, "The truth lies not in what you see, but in what you refuse to face." "Victor," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Whoever left this knows more than they should. We're running out of time." Victor rose from where he'd been sitting, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion and regret. Eleanor always believed the truth would surface one way or another. I thought I could bury it, but maybe she was right. Emily studied him, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. You've been running from this for years. Whatever you're hiding, it's time to face it before it destroys Ansley. The next morning, the Prescott estate was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed on Emily's nerves. She spent hours sorting through the letters and documents they'd uncovered, hoping for a breakthrough. Eleanor's notes hinted at someone close to the family betraying her trust, but the identity of the culprit remained elusive. Meanwhile, Victor disappeared into his study, emerging only briefly to bark orders at his staff. His face was pale, his movements hurried, as if he were preparing for battle. By midday, Emily couldn't take the silence any longer. She stormed into his study, slamming the door behind her. Enough of this, Victor, she demanded. If you're hiding something else, I need to know what it is. No more lies, no more half-truths. Victor didn't look up from the papers on his desk. You think I want this, Emily? You think I want my daughter's life hanging by a thread because of my mistakes? Then stop shutting me out, she yelled. You might not care about your legacy, but I care about Ansley. And so did Eleanor. Victor's hands clenched into fists. He looked at Emily, his eyes haunted. Eleanor knew what I'd done. She knew I drained the trust to keep my business afloat. But there's more to this than you understand. Then explain it to me. Emily shot back, her voice cracking with desperation. Victor sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Before Eleanor died, she discovered that someone close to us was feeding information about the trust to outside parties. She thought it was a family member, a cousin, maybe even my brother. But she couldn't prove it. And what did you do? Emily asked, her voice softening. I ignored her, Victor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I told her she was being paranoid. I thought she was overreacting. But then the trust started losing money faster than I could explain. Deals fell through, investments tanked. By the time I realized she was right, it was too late. Emily stared at him, a mixture of anger and pity washing over her. You let her fight alone. I thought I was protecting her, Victor said, his voice breaking. But all I did was push her away. Emily left the study, her mind racing. If Eleanor had been investigating a betrayal, perhaps her notes contained more clues than she realized. She returned to the attic and began combing through the papers again. Hours later, she found a small, folded note tucked inside the lining of one of Eleanor's journals. The handwriting was hurried and shaky, as if written in a moment of panic. Meet me at the Old Oak at dusk. Bring the ledger. We can end this. Emily's heart pounded. The note was dated just a week before Eleanor's death. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily confronted Victor again, showing him the note. Do you know about this? She asked, thrusting it toward him. Victor took the paper, his face paling as he read it. The Old Oak, that's on the edge of the property. Eleanor used to call it her thinking spot. Emily nodded. If she went there to meet someone, it might explain what happened to her. But why didn't you ever mention this? I didn't know, Victor admitted. She never told me about this meeting. Emily narrowed her eyes. Or maybe you didn't want to know. That evening, Emily made her way to the Old Oak, flashlight in hand. The massive tree stood at the edge of the Prescott estate, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. She searched the area around the tree, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, she found nothing but leaves and dirt. But then, near the base of the tree, her foot struck something solid. Kneeling, she unearthed a small, weathered box buried shallowly in the ground. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a bundle of papers and an old leather ledger. The ledger was filled with financial records, transactions linked to the trust. But what caught Emily's attention was a single name that appeared repeatedly, John Prescott. Victor's brother. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. John had been siphoning money from the trust, using Eleanor's death and Victor's ignorance to cover his tracks. She returned to the house, clutching the ledger tightly. As she entered the study, Victor looked up, his face weary. "I found this at the Old Oak," Emily said, placing the ledger on his desk. "Your brother was stealing from the trust." Victor's eyes widened as he scanned the records. "John, I can't believe this." "You need to confront him," Emily said firmly. "Ainsley's life depends on it." The next morning, Victor made arrangements to meet John at a local cafe, away from the estate. Emily insisted on coming along, unwilling to let Victor face his brother alone. When John arrived, his demeanor was calm, almost smug. He greeted Victor with a casual nod before turning to Emily. "And who's this?" John asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "She's the one who uncovered your little operation," Victor replied, his voice cold. John chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Operation? Oh, come now, Victor. Don't act like you're innocent in all this. You're the one who put the trust in jeopardy to begin with." "That doesn't excuse what you did," Victor shot back. "You betrayed your own family." John's smile faded, replaced by a hard, calculating expression. "I did what I had to do. Just like you." The tension between the brothers was palpable, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that John had more planned than he was letting on. As the conversation escalated, John leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've always underestimated me, Victor. But this time, you won't win. And neither will that little girl of yours." Victor's fists clenched, but Emily placed a hand on his arm, stopping him from reacting. "You're not going to get away with this," Emily said, her voice steady. "We'll fight you every step of the way." John smirked, rising from his seat. "Good luck with that." As he walked away, Emily felt a knot of dread tightening in her chest. The Prescott family's fight was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The days following the confrontation with John Prescott were tense, filled with a suffocating unease that seemed to settle over the Prescott estate like a dark cloud. Emily and Victor were both on edge, their every move watched by unseen eyes. But as the urgency of their situation increased, Emily could sense the walls closing in around them, and they had no choice but to act quickly before John could put his plans into motion. Victor spent hours in his study, poring over the ledger Emily had uncovered. The numbers, names, and transactions seemed to blend together into an impenetrable wall of deception. But one thing was clear: John had been siphoning money from the trust for years, redirecting funds to shadowy accounts, laundering the family's fortune for his own gain. Emily could hear the frustration in Victor's voice as he muttered to himself. "This can't be happening. I've lost everything, and now my brother's taken it all." Her heart went out to him, but she couldn't afford to let him fall into despair. "Victor, we can't waste any more time. We need to find a way to expose him before he takes everything we have left." Victor slammed the ledger down onto his desk, his eyes wild with anger. "You don't understand, Emily. John has connections, people who will protect him. If we go public with this, we could lose more than just the trust. Ainsley's future could be at risk. But if we do nothing, John wins," Emily replied firmly. "And Ainsley deserves the chance to make her own decisions, not live in the shadow of your brother's betrayal." Victor stared at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "You're right. But how do we expose him without putting her in danger?" Emily paced across the room, her mind racing. "We use what he doesn't know we have. We have evidence. We have the ledger. If we take it to the right people, lawyers, the press, it'll force him out in the open." Victor was silent for a long moment before he nodded slowly. "All right. But I need you to promise me one thing, Emily." "What is it?" "If anything happens, if this backfires, you keep Ainsley safe. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her, but I need you to promise me you'll keep her away from this madness." Emily looked into his eyes, seeing the desperation that mirrored her own. "I promise." The next morning, they made their move. Emily contacted a trusted lawyer, someone outside of Victor's usual circle of business contacts, and arranged to meet at a secluded location, far from the eyes of anyone who might be watching. They could not afford to let John or anyone connected to him learn of their plans until it was too late. When they arrived at the lawyer's office, Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. If they were going to expose John, they had to do it now. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s named Margaret, sat them down and listened carefully as Emily explained everything that had happened, from Victor's mismanagement of the trust to the discovery of John's betrayal. "I've reviewed the documents," Margaret said, her voice calm but professional. "This is a serious case. But we'll need more than just these records to build a case against your brother. I'll need to get in touch with my contacts at the bank, trace these transactions, and start preparing a formal complaint." Victor nodded, his fingers wide against the armrests of the chair. "Do what you need to. I'm willing to go to court if it means stopping him." The next few days felt like an eternity. Margaret worked tirelessly to gather evidence, contacting financial institutions, subpoenaing records, and piecing together the intricate web of John's deception. Emily remained by Victor's side, helping to organize the materials and making sure that Ansley stayed as far away from the growing conflict as possible. But even as the evidence mounted, Emily felt a growing sense of unease. She knew they were taking a significant risk, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much danger they were all in. John wouldn't just sit back and let them take what was his, he would fight back. And with the power and resources he had at his disposal, she wasn't sure if they could win. On the 6th day of their preparations, Emily received a call that shook her to her core. "Emily, it's Margaret. I need you and Victor to come down to the office right away. We found something you need to see." They arrived at Margaret's office in a flurry of anxiety. The lawyer was waiting for them, her face grim. "This is bigger than we thought," she said, motioning to the stack of papers on her desk. "I've traced the transactions and confirmed that John has been laundering not only money from the trust, but also from several of your personal accounts, Victor. There are offshore accounts and hidden assets all over the world." Victor's face went pale as he took in the gravity of what she was saying. "You're telling me he's been stealing from me, from all of us?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, and it gets worse. I've also uncovered something that suggests your brother might have had a hand in Eleanor's death." Victor froze, his expression one of disbelief and shock. "What do you mean?" According to some of the bank records and encrypted communications, there were several large payments made to a medical facility shortly before Eleanor's accident. It's unclear exactly what the payments were for, but they coincide with her sudden decline in health. Emily felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. "You're saying John might have been involved in Eleanor's death?" Margaret's eyes were hard, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "It's too early to say for sure, but the evidence points to something more than just negligence. It looks like John may have been involved in silencing her." Victor's hands trembled as he reached for the papers, his eyes scanning the documents with growing horror. "My God! If this is true, then everything we've done, everything Eleanor worked for, was for nothing." Emily stepped forward, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "We can't think like that, Victor. We need to focus on the truth. The truth about John and everything he's done. We'll make sure it all comes out." Victor looked up at her, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret. "But at what cost, Emily? What will happen to Ansley when the truth comes out?" "We will protect her," Emily said firmly. "We'll expose John for what he is, and we'll make sure Ansley has a future that isn't tainted by his crimes." As they left Margaret's office, Emily could feel the weight of their decisions pressing down on them. The path ahead was unclear, and the dangers they faced were growing by the day. But one thing was certain, they were going to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The battle for the Prescott family's legacy had only just begun. The sight of John approaching the house sent a jolt of adrenaline through Emily. His purposeful stride, flanked by two imposing figures, left no doubt that this wasn't a casual visit. The shadows of the night obscured their faces, but their intentions were clear. This was an escalation. Emily crouched low near Starfire's stall, her heart pounding as she debated her next move. Victor had to know they were here. But if she left the stables, she risked being seen. "Stay quiet, boy," she whispered, patting Starfire's flank before slipping out through the rear stable door. The cool night air bit at her skin as she crept toward the side entrance of the house. Inside, Victor sat in his study, poring over the ledger for the 100th time. His hands trembled as he traced the incriminating transactions, the full weight of his brother's betrayal pressing down on him like a vice. The knock on the front door startled him, breaking his concentration. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight. "Who on earth?" he muttered, rising to his feet. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice that sent chills down his spine. "Victor, it's me," John called out, his tone deceptively calm. "We need to talk." Emily reached the side entrance just in time to see Victor hesitating near the front door. "Don't," she hissed, her voice urgent but quiet enough not to carry. Victor turned, startled. "Emily? What are you doing?" "John's not alone," she whispered, her eyes wide. "He brought men with him. Whatever he wants, it's not good." Victor's expression hardened, and he stepped away from the door. "Then we'll handle it together." But before they could decide on their next move, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. "They're breaking in!" Emily exclaimed, grabbing Victor's arm. "Go to Ansley's room," Victor ordered, his voice firm. "Lock the door and call the police." Emily sprinted up the stairs, her mind racing as she dialed 911. The operator's calm voice barely registered as she explained the situation, giving the address and emphasizing the urgency. "They're inside the house," she said, her voice shaking. "Please send someone quickly." She locked the door to Ansley's room and braced herself against it, her ears straining to catch every sound. Footsteps echoed through the halls below, heavy and deliberate. "Find the ledger," John's voice commanded, cold and sharp. "And bring him to me." Emily's stomach churned. They weren't just after Victor, they were after the evidence. Downstairs, Victor stood his ground in the study, clutching the ledger tightly. His pulse raced as the footsteps drew closer. When John entered the room, his expression was smug, but his eyes burned with barely contained fury. "Victor," John said, spreading his arms in mock camaraderie. "Why make this harder than it needs to be? Just give me the ledger, and we'll pretend this never happened." Victor's grip on the ledger tightened. "You think I'd trust you after everything you've done? After Eleanor?" John's smirk faltered. "Eleanor made her choice, Victor. She chose to fight a battle she couldn't win. Don't make the same mistake." "She trusted you," Victor said, his voice shaking with anger. "She believed in family. And you killed her for it." John's face darkened. "Watch your mouth, brother. You don't know what you're talking about." As the tension in the study reached a boiling point, Emily searched Ansley's room for anything she could use to protect herself. Her eyes landed on a heavy brass lamp, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles white. The sound of a door opening down the hall made her heart skip a beat. One of John's men was searching the upstairs rooms. Emily moved silently to the corner of the room, her back against the wall as the footsteps approached. When the doorknob rattled, she held her breath, willing the lock to hold. "Check downstairs," the man called out after a moment, his voice fading as he moved away. Emily exhaled shakily, relief flooding through her. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. In the study, John's patience wore thin. "Enough of this, Victor," he snapped. "You've already lost. Hand over the ledger, or I'll make sure Ansley pays the price for your stubbornness." Victor's blood boiled. "Leave my daughter out of this." John sneered. "You think I haven't noticed how much she means to you? She's your Achilles heel, Victor. And I'm not above using it." The rage that had been simmering inside Victor finally erupted. He lunged at John, catching him off guard and knocking him to the ground. The ledger fell from his grasp, sliding across the floor. One of John's men rushed in, pulling Victor off his brother and pinning him against the wall. John stood, brushing himself off. "You never were a fighter, Victor. You always left the dirty work to others." Upstairs, Emily heard the commotion and knew she had to act. Clutching the brass lamp, she crept down the stairs, her heart pounding with every step. When she reached the study, she saw Victor restrained by one of John's men, while John rifled through the desk drawers. "Looking for this?" Emily called out, stepping into the doorway and holding up the ledger. John's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Hand it over, Emily." "No." Emily shook her head, her voice steady despite her fear. "Not a chance." The man holding Victor released him and started toward Emily, but she swung the lamp with all her strength, catching him across the head. He collapsed with a groan, and Victor seized the opportunity to tackle John. The two brothers struggled, years of resentment boiling over into a violent clash. Emily grabbed the ledger and moved to call the police again, but before she could, John broke free, grabbing a heavy paperweight and swinging it toward Victor. Emily screamed as the two men fell to the floor, the struggle continuing. Sirens wailed in the distance, and the flashing lights of police cars illuminated the night. John's remaining accomplice fled as the police stormed the house, pulling the brothers apart and arresting John on the spot. As the chaos subsided, Emily found herself standing in the study, the ledger clutched tightly to her chest. Victor sat on the floor, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. "It's over," she said softly, her voice trembling. Victor looked up at her, his eyes filled with both relief and regret. "For now," he replied. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the Prescott family's fight was far from over. The morning after the stormy night of John's arrest, the Prescott estate was quiet again, though the silence carried the weight of exhaustion and relief. Emily sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched in front of her. Her hands were still trembling, the events of the previous night playing on a loop in her mind. Victor entered, moving slowly, his face swollen and bruised. He sat across from her, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering from the police medic's visit. "I've called Margaret," he began, his voice hoarse. "She's working with the authorities to ensure the trust is restored. They've frozen John's accounts and started the process to recover what he stole." Emily nodded, though she could barely meet his eyes. The toll of his decisions was written all over him, and for once, he looked less like the powerful businessman and more like a man who had been defeated by his own choices. "Have you been to see Ansley?" she asked softly. Victor sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Not yet. I'm afraid to face her, Emily. How do I look her in the eye after everything I've done?" Emily leaned forward, her tone firm but gentle. "You show up. That's what she needs. Not excuses or apologies, just you." At the hospital, Ansley's room was filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the faint scent of disinfectant. Victor entered hesitantly, his footsteps almost silent. Emily followed, standing near the door to give him space. Ansley looked so small in the hospital bed, her pale face framed by her fiery curls. Victor sat beside her, his hand trembling as he reached out to hold hers. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking. "It's Dad. I'm here." For a long moment, there was no response. Then, to their astonishment, Ansley's fingers twitched and her eyelids fluttered open. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice weak but unmistakable. Victor let out a choked sob, pressing her hand to his lips. "I'm here, baby. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Emily stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "You're awake, Ansley. You're going to be okay." Ansley's gaze shifted to Emily, and a faint smile appeared on her lips. "You're here too." As the days passed, Ansley began to recover, her strength slowly returning. The bond between father and daughter, once fractured, began to heal as Victor dedicated himself fully to her care. But the damage John had inflicted on the family still lingered. The process of restoring the trust was long and arduous, and Victor faced public scrutiny as the truth of his mismanagement came to light. Margaret visited the estate often, bringing updates on the case and ensuring that John's accomplices were held accountable. "It's going to take time," she warned one afternoon. "The trust can be salvaged, but the damage to your reputation may take years to repair." Victor nodded grimly. "I don't care about my reputation anymore. I just want to make things right for Ansley." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in golden light, Emily found Victor in the stables. He was with Starfire, brushing the horse's coat with slow, deliberate movements. "She's asked to see him," Victor said without turning around. Emily smiled. "Ansley's connection to Starfire is special. I think it'll help her heal." Victor paused, his hand resting on the horse's mane. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" "She already has," Emily said gently. "But you need to forgive yourself." Victor's eyes filled with tears as he turned to Emily. "How do you forgive a lifetime of mistakes?" "You start by making better choices," she replied. "One day at a time." The next day, Ansley was strong enough to sit outside in her wheelchair, bundled in blankets against the crisp autumn air. When Victor brought Starfire over, her eyes lit up with joy. "Starfire," she exclaimed, her voice filled with more life than they'd heard in weeks. Victor lifted her gently onto the horse's back, holding her steady as Starfire trotted slowly around the yard. Ansley's laughter echoed through the estate, a sound that brought tears to Emily's eyes. In that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by hope for the future. Months later, the Prescott family held a ceremony to rededicate the trust, ensuring that it would be used to support causes Eleanor had cared deeply about: animal welfare, education, and community programs. Emily stood beside Victor and Ansley as they unveiled a bronze statue of Eleanor and Starfire, a symbol of the legacy they were determined to protect. As the crowd applauded, Victor leaned down to whisper to Ansley, "This is for you, sweetheart. Everything we do from now on is for you." Ansley smiled up at him, her eyes bright. "And for Mom too." Victor nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of sorrow and pride. "And for Mom too." That night, as Emily prepared to leave the estate for the last time, Victor approached her at the door. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" he asked. Emily shook her head, her smile bittersweet. "It's time for me to move on, Victor. You and Ansley have each other now. You'll be okay." He reached out, taking her hand. "We wouldn't have made it without you, Emily. Thank you for everything." Tears filled her eyes as she embraced him. "Take care of her. Take care of yourself." As Emily drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the Prescott estate fading into the distance. She felt a sense of peace, knowing she had done her part to help a family find its way back from the brink. In the end, the truth had prevailed, and though the scars of the past would remain, they no longer defined the future. Would you like to discuss or explore any part of the story further?